Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 24th, where we are putting some closure on Citizen Kane. And as you know, this is considered to be an incredibly important film in cinema studies. Now, that said, I understand that the idea of what is important can be subjective, but I also hope there are also some objective elements that would in one way or another defend the idea of Citizen Kane being on these best of lists. And more often than not, it's usually listed as the number one film in the best of lists. And I believe I was the first to indicate that when I was first introduced to Citizen Kane, when I was an undergraduate student, I saw the film and I really didn't understand why it was considered to be such a great film. And it was only after the fact when I studied the film that I saw and realized how incredibly ahead of its time it truly was for a film of the 1940s. It really, at that point, influenced all of the films that have come afterwards and continues to influence films even in 2025, which is why I began with giving you some background about Citizen Kane so that you could understand a little bit of its historical importance in cinema. The idea that Citizen Kane is loosely, quote unquote, based on William Randolph Hearst, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful individuals of his time. If I were to think about something or someone comparable today, perhaps it would be Elon Musk. And Orson Welles of War of the Worlds fame, that he had broadcast a radio program that simulated Martians landing and invading the Earth, landing on and invading Earth. And it was so realistic, that radio play, that individuals believed it. And there was mass panic and even reported suicides. And it should have ended Orson Welles' career, but it didn't. It got him a Hollywood contract with unlimited control. And that Hollywood contract ended up becoming Citizen Kane, which ended Orson Welles' career effectively because William Randolph Hearst made it his lifelong mission to destroy Orson Welles. He was successful in destroying Orson Welles. He was not successful in destroying the film, luckily, so we still have that today. And we can talk about how this particular film is so significant, not just from a historical perspective in the ways that it simulated, but also took liberties with William Randolph Hearst's history, but we can talk about this film from a cinematic perspective, that it did things that no film had done at the time. Remember, no CGI at the time, which is why I had wanted you to watch Citizen Kane twice, both just to first appreciate the film. Notice how the film begins and ends in the same way with that no trespassing sign. And of course, we as viewers are trespassing the entire time. So right from the beginning of the film, it's got thematic significance. The idea that we're looking through that fence or gate in the no trespassing sign, and how oftentimes we're presented with symbols or images of cages or shadows of cages. Again, the idea of entrapment. But watching film critic, perhaps the most noted film critic, Roger Ebert, analyze Citizen Kane shot by shot, scene by scene, and talking about all of the reasons why that film was so progressive, from its use of camera angles and filming techniques, probably best known for deep focus, that everything is focused in a shot, which requires a lot more effort from the viewer when they're watching the shot. And from a technological perspective, considering the technology of the time, seemed like an impossibility. The way that the film used, as Roger Ebert calls, special effects. In fact, Roger Ebert had argued that the film is perhaps as sophisticated with its special effects usage as any of the Star Wars films. The thing is that the special effects are invisible. So Orson Welles wanted to give a sense of reality to the film. So using things like matte drawings and using things like progressive makeup techniques to age characters, things that we take for granted nowadays. Even something as simple as overlapping dialogue makes this film a particularly complex film. But Roger Ebert talks about it in a way that I never could, as he goes through it scene by scene, explaining how things were filmed and how revolutionary it was for its time. And to be quite honest with you, Roger Ebert just barely scratches the surface of why this film is so important. From a literary perspective, the examination of a great man who experiences downfall, it's very much like a Greek tragedy in some respects. And Rosebud, the sled, is perhaps the most famous cinematic image and word in history. And when we find out that it's the sled, and I hope I'm not giving you any spoilers, you would have seen the film twice by this point. And what that sled symbolizes, a lost youth that Cain didn't have when he was taken from his mother and his father so that he could become rich and famous. And Cain spends the rest of his life trying to fill that void with money and with objects, and is continually dissatisfied. And we see that at the very end, his dying word, rosebud, illustrates that. And all of those elements are elements important to understand why Citizen Kane is so highly esteemed in cinematic studies. But again, it might turn out that you're not a fan of it, and that's perfectly fine as well, but you should know about it. And just looking at the film visually, in fact, I've even suggested that you might want to keep the volume off and just watch the visuals. Just the use of light and shadow, which is something that you have a great opportunity to do in black and white. Not that they would have had a choice at that point. But that in and of itself is a fascinating way to view the film. But if you're curious, in my mind, the perfect scene is not from Citizen Kane. The perfect scene is from something that's much more contemporary, and it's not even from film. It's technically from television. You might be familiar with the show Stranger Things that is shown on Netflix, and if you're a fan, you might be familiar with the scene that features a character named Max who is running away from a monster named Vecna, and she's in a supernatural realm, and the scene is oftentimes used as a metaphor for suicide and depression, and that Max is basically in a very dark place and is trying to find the light, if you will, of her friends who are urging her to emerge from the darkness. But the literal scene is she's trying to run away from the supernatural Vecna in the supernatural realm and get back to her realm of humanity. Right now she's in a place called the Upside Down. And the scene with the use of music and how music can be so healing and life-saving. I'd say that scene has it all. It's got the perfect cinematography, score, special effects, lighting, acting, directing, writing, editing, pacing, set design, sound, makeup, costuming. And if you want to see the scene, it's below. Again, it may not make a whole lot of sense if you aren't familiar with the film, but it was one of those goosebump moments, or I should say if you're not familiar with the television show, but it's one of those goosebump moments. So, as you know, we talked a little bit about paper number one, so certainly Citizen Kane is an option for you for paper number one, but we're going to move beyond film and start talking about short story, and short story is also an option for you for paper number one. And I do encourage early papers. I do have rolling deadlines, but I had identified a deadline of approximately midway through the semester, so that at that point, hopefully, you would have submitted in a paper. I'm going to be a bit anxious if you haven't submitted it in a paper by that point. Certainly, you can submit in a paper after that point. Just keep me apprised. And it's a critical paper, so you don't need to use outside research or resources. Approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be, about either our film in our fiction section, which was Citizen Kane, or one of the short stories that we will be talking about. And this is in the syllabus and other documents folder. And I wanted to draw your attention to the possibilities that we could be talking about for the final paper. I had identified the idea of canon, which we talked a little bit about, and we will continue to talk about today and through the rest of the semester. And you can talk about whether or not Citizen Kane or one of the short stories deserves to be part of the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics that are worth academic study because they've got a certain level of depth. They've got a certain level of sophistication to them. They probably talk about timeless and universal themes. They examine what it means to be human. They're doing something that's creative. They are written to offer some sort of a social commentary. It's not just for generating profit. They aren't just formulaic. They do things that are interesting, or as I like to define canon, something that you can rewatch or reread, and each time you do, you get new meaning from it. So I wanted to illustrate this idea by our talking about two short stories, and those are included in the links that I provided for you because they are not included in the text of the newest version of the book that I had ordered, A Secret Sorrow and a Sorrowful Woman, and one is considered to be rather formulaic. It's literature in the sense that it's written word, and I guess that basically is the broadest definition for literature, something that is written. Though if you know anything about literature and the great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they all began from the oral tradition. And you know that in this class we're talking about film as a kind of literature. But when you go to a store asking for a piece of literature on the, let's say, vacuum cleaner, you're really asking for an instruction manual. Once you've read it, you don't need to reread it and find new meaning or depth or sophistication to it. We are talking about the films and the written texts that do allow for multiple rereadings, that because they're not predictable, they're not formulaic, they're not trite, they're not usually characterized by a genre, they don't have strict rules that they need to follow for plot or character or setting or love scenes or writing or length. And our example of that is going to be the short story, A Sorrowful Woman. But I also wanted to have you read something that is considered formulaic, not to in any way disparage romance novels. It's a chapter from a romance novel, A Secret Sorrow. However, we could have done this with any genre literature, and horror is certainly an option. As you know, I'm a Gothic fan, which is the origins of the horror tradition, and some pieces are better than others, and I'm sure the same is with romances. But the piece that I had you read that we are going to be talking about is pretty much predictable, formulaic, trite, and doesn't require a lot of thought or effort in the way that the other piece, A Sorrowful Woman, does, even though both of these pieces have similar titles, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, which points to the idea that oftentimes literature is dark and it talks about things like sorrow. And perhaps it's because an author or filmmaker needs to be motivated to be able to create their art, and maybe these intense emotions like sadness or conflict help to motivate them to do that. And when they're experiencing more positive emotions, like let's say happiness, perhaps they're busy experiencing the emotion and not necessarily writing about it or filming about it. That's not to say that all literature and film is dark, but a lot of it is, or at least a lot of it is that's considered part of the canon. One of the reasons why when we get to our drama section, I wanted to talk about a Shakespearean comedy, not a tragedy. So by nature, a comedy is much lighter. But nevertheless, we are focusing on short story, which is a brief piece of prose fiction. Our textbook has a list of questions for us to consider about plot. That's the most important and the least important. You need to know what's going on, but what is going on is not nearly as important as why those things are going on. It's what I call the difference between the junior high school book report of what's happening to prove that you saw the film or you read the text, as opposed to understanding why those things happen. So we can do a summary of Citizen Kane, but what's much more important is talking about the whys of Citizen Kane, the interpretations associated with all of these different perspectives we're given of Kane. And of course, all of them are subjective, and how we get all of these circular narratives about Kane. But if you don't want to talk about Kane, perhaps you want to talk about Sorrowful Woman or one of the other upcoming short stories. Character. Well, who are the characters? What are their names? How do they change? Do we like them? Do we not like them? Symbolism, which is usually something that's concrete that represents something that is not concrete. For instance, a flag, something that's concrete representing something that is not concrete, like patriotism. Or perhaps a sled, like Rosebud, representing perhaps a lost youth or a search for love. What are the theme or themes? Usually there are multiple messages that are embedded in there. Certainly Citizen Kane has lots of messages about the unsatisfactory elements associated with achieving wealth. One of my favorite lines in Citizen Kane is that, it's not so hard to be rich if all you want to be is rich. And usually what we want are other things in addition to money. And that's something that Charles Foster Kane seems to struggle with, as he uses people the way he uses possessions. Leland, his best friend, talks about that. But that's only one of the many themes in Citizen Kane. I mean, certainly it talks about the influence of media. At the time, newspapers were the vehicle for giving information. Talking about Citizen Kane from a gender perspective and how women are portrayed. That's also another fascinating way to talk about Kane. Thinking about the style of how something is told, what language is used, the tone. Is it happy? Is it sad? One of the things Roger Ebert illustrates about Citizen Kane is that there's so many different genre-like elements within Kane. You want a mystery? We get a mystery story. You want a drama? You get a drama story. You want a romance? You get a romance story. You even get a musical number in there if you so want it. Perhaps that's one of the ways that Citizen Kane was able to appeal to such a broad audience, because it has so many different elements to it. Irony, the exact opposite of what you expect, but with a twist, known as frisson, for instance, in France. And, the best example that I can give of irony is actually from a television show, The Twilight Zone, which is from the 1950s, originally. An episode called Time Enough at Last that you might be familiar with. It's one of their more famous episodes. The Twilight Zone at the time had some of the best short story writers of the day, actually. And in this story, Time Enough at Last, there is this harried husband and employee. He works at a bank, and he basically is henpecked by both his boss and also his wife. This man just wants to spend time reading, but he can't do that at work because he has a job to do at the bank, and he can't do that at home because he has chores to perform. And certainly when we are watching or reading a story, we sometimes have to suspend disbelief. So what ends up happening in the story is that the man locks himself in the vault of the bank accidentally at night or at the ending of the day, and all of the employees are gone. So he knows he's going to have to spend the night there. Keep in mind, no cell phones or anything like that. Not that you could get a signal, I don't think, in a bank vault. And when he's in that vault, it seems that the vault offers him enough protection that he's able to survive the nuclear blast that occurs, that destroys all of society around him. And he crawls out of the rubble of the vault, and he realizes that society is destroyed. And at first he's distraught, but then he's quite pleased because he realizes that now he doesn't have a wife or a boss that he needs to basically satisfy. So he has time enough at last to read. So he finds his way to the rubble of a library. Again, suspend some disbelief that the books have survived the nuclear blast. And he's able to find a bunch of books that he puts into a pile that he's getting ready to read with full anticipation. And then we see as he looks down, because he's wearing very thick Coca-Cola-like glasses that at the time would have been made out of glass, not plastic. Those glasses slip off of his face and shatter onto the ground. So now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. What a great example of irony. I believe your text gives you the example of a firehouse burning down. That would be ironic because firehouses are housed by firefighters and you expect them to put out fires, not to necessarily experience fires. But short stories in particular will often use irony, though there's certainly irony in Citizen Kane as well. And the critical strategies that we began the semester with talking about viewing a text from a particular lens, whether it be the biography of the creator or it be a psychological analysis of the characters or the author or even ourselves as reader or viewer. And there's lots of different ways that you can go about doing something like that. The textbook talks about a series of questions that you can ask yourself as well. And not that I want you to go through those questions and check them off in a checklist fashion. That takes away all the joy from viewing a film or from reading a text. But keep those all in the back of your mind. And some of them might even inspire you for creating a paper topic if it turns out that you don't want to write about canon. Or the second option that I gave you for the paper is talking about something that does or does not have contemporary relevance. And this one is a little bit trickier because one of the elements of canon oftentimes is that it has contemporary relevance. But there are lots of other elements involved with canon as well when you examine whether or not something should or should not be in the canon. And both of those positions can be equally valid. It's based on the evidence that you put forth from the text itself in order to present an argument that's possible. Not even probable, just possible. Much like a good attorney can take defense or prosecution and do an equally good job with both. And obviously, there might be a situation where there's more evidence on one side or another, but a good attorney knows how to pick and choose their pieces of evidence so that they've got a valid argument. And then it's up to the judge and jury to make the determination. And for you, what you're doing is you're taking an argument and there isn't a judge or a jury, but I, as reader, will make evaluation. But you all have the opportunity of rewriting that first paper because I see it as a learning exercise. So I am asking you to consider writing that first paper, especially because it turns out that I'm going to need to miss 2 classes that will be coming up. And that gives you a wonderful opportunity to catch up with anything that you might have fallen behind with, to get ahead because you've got all of the readings in your course outline. And more importantly, to even work on your paper if you so decided to work on your paper during that time. So you've got lots of ways that you can utilize that time efficiently and effectively because I need to be out of town during those 2 classes. And I will remind you of this in our Moodle site as well about, and you can see this in the notes as well below about my needing to miss 2 classes next week. I will be missing the Wednesday class and then the following Monday class. But use your time efficiently, use your time effectively. And in terms of thinking about how to go about reading a text, and much of this is similar to watching a film, since we've been talking about both of these sharing lots of similarities. Thinking about the author, who is the author and how might that be important? Thinking about the date and how might that be important to inform our understanding of the piece. Thinking about the title, because titles are important. Thinking about plot, of course, and characters and setting. Where is the story taking place, and is the setting used perhaps symbolically? Is it representational? The use of language, the themes, the ending. Endings can be very important. Important quotes, whether it be from a film or whether it be from a text. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper about film and text and how you go about quoting. Hopefully this is a bit of a review, because you would have talked a little bit about this in Composition 1, at least with text. With film, if you're curious, what you do is you list a timestamp in your parentheses after the quote, rather than listing a page number. But more on that later. Questions. So if you're using the textbook, the text will have questions at the end that might inform your understanding, but also, what are your personal questions about a particular text? And all of those are things to consider whenever you are examining a film or you are reading a piece of literature. So what we are going to be talking about is A Secret Sorrow, that short story that basically is formulaic and trite and predictable, as opposed to A Sorrowful Woman, which really is a short story that has more depth and sophistication. And honestly, A Secret Sorrow isn't even a short story. It happens to be the excerpt of a chapter of a novel. So the idea that we could just jump in there, even though we haven't read the novel, that's a bad sign. And A Sorrowful Woman, a short story that stands on its own, but it leads to questions right from the very beginning. In the future, what we're going to be doing is talking about things like the short story, The Story of an Hour, and you can see that in the notes below under the 9th section, where I've given you a web link for that. But if you've got the newest edition of the book, you'll see that that was included in the earlier set of readings that I had assigned for the understanding of how to read and write about literature. But I wanted us to revisit that short story and to begin to analyze it. And also the short story A Rose for Emily, which also is followed by an interview by the author, an excerpt that is included in your text, where the author talks a little bit about some of their motivations for writing that particular story. But at this point, I wanted you to consider paper number 1, and I know this is very early on, but as I indicated, I am going to need to miss 2 classes. The classes I'm missing are Wednesday, October 1st, and Monday, October 6th. And again, you can see that in the notes, and I will be reminding you over our next couple of classes. So the attendance question, which would be due for us Friday, the 26th, and as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your peers. What you are required to do, however, is to read all of your peer responses and my responses in turn, because that'll give you a good idea of what it is that we are talking about in, or would have talked about in a face-to-face situation. And perhaps some of those responses might encourage you to come up with your own topic for a paper. But since we're talking about paper number 1, which I'm going to follow up with next class, do you have any questions about paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? So if you don't have any questions, you can just say that at this point you don't have questions. But if you do have questions, you can respond to that in our discussion forum. And then next class, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper, as well as the examples that I've given of A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, which basically means that this is the time that we're transitioning from film into the readings for the class, because I'm hopeful by this point you would have gotten the text and you would have settled in. I try to start the semester a little bit more slowly, understanding that people are dropping and adding and getting the text and so forth. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class talking about A Secret Sorrow, A Sorrowful Woman, what is canon, and also some of the conventions of writing a paper. And again, it behooves you to get ahead. Some of the short stories that are coming up after that, The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, and of course the others are listed in your course outline. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.